All right. What about now? Well, praise the Lord. Let's start over. Let's try this again. We're going to jump right into the lesson today. I had planned this as a 6-week series on parenting, kind of an overview, core principles, which we touched on. Then taking a week to specifically talk about unconditional love as the foundation. Then I was going to take one Sunday to talk about discipline, one Sunday to talk about communication and understanding, one Sunday about conflict and its resolution, and then one Sunday about letting go. And I was afraid this might happen, and it has happened. Discipline is probably the one I think that I want to talk the most about, just because I think practically speaking, it's where the rubber meets the road in parenting. That's kind of how we equate parenting with discipline. And there's just enough there that I want to make sure we don't rush through it. So I may combine the conflict and communication lesson, especially since we've touched on those topics early this year. So today is the beginning conversation about discipline. And I know I'd promised some practical, actual things you could do. But I think before we get there, we have to focus again on principles. What's the point? What's the purpose of discipline? As a very quick recap, and I want to kind of preface this again, because we are getting to where the rubber meets the road. And when we start talking about how we discipline our children, that's can be a very touchy subject, right? That's the reason that schools do the whole, zero tolerance policies, because no one can be at fault. Well, my little boy couldn't possibly. So we just punish everybody. We don't look into the situation. We just get them all. And that way we don't have to, fight with the parents, which I don't think is healthy, but that's the way we've decided to do as a society. Point is, discipline is very personal. And the default reaction, I think, of most people when they're told you should treat your children this way, then is to get defensive. And so I just want to remind us all, we are trying to take a kind of biblical point of view and consider a position of learning and growing, right? A lot of times, I know this personally because those of you who have had parents, you probably had the same experience. Before you have kids, you know how to parent. And then you have children, and you're disabused of that notion. I had a lot of ideas about what I want to do. And this may be, take it for what it's worth. For the most part, I still believe in the same ideas. I still feel like the principles, but the thing that was tough for me was, I felt I'd be better at it. Like I knew what to do. I knew I had good examples of how to parent. I had a wealth of good examples. I knew what to do, so I should just be able to do it, right? Seems a little harder than that. So there were many times, still are times, in this journey where I realized, I've fallen short some way. And it can be very painful when someone else is telling you something and you realize you've fallen short. But the goal here is not to look at ourselves and beat ourselves up, or look at each other and judge, well, they really needed to hear this. No. If we see things in here that are hitting a little close to home and feel like they're sensitive, maybe what we do is don't beat yourself up for the past. Just look at it and say, what's the best thing to do going forward? I'm not going to worry about what was. I can't change the past. I can't undo, if I've made mistakes, I can't undo those mistakes. I can't go back in time and reparent differently. So how do I move forward? What do I want to do going forward? This is not a place for judgment. This is not me telling you that you're a bad parent. The classic, if there's one pointing at you, there's 4 pointing at me. That's why I always point like this. But really, I'm speaking from painful personal experience on most of this. So having said that, discipline. Let's start with, and I'm going to ask y'all, I'm going to take you to some scripture. I'm going to read some scripture for you. But before we go there, I want y'all to be thinking, because I'm going to ask you, what is discipline? What do y'all think? How do you define discipline? All right, let's read some scripture. I have on this next slide Proverbs 3. I thought I had Proverbs 3. Maybe not. No, I don't. Proverbs 12. Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid. How many of y'all, that's the rule? We don't say stupid. Well, Bible's very clear here. If you hate reproof, if you hate to be corrected, you're stupid. All right, what about Proverbs 19:18? This one, I don't know why we don't quote this one more often. We always quote, the spare the rod, spoil the child, right? I don't even think that's direct biblical quote. That's kind of taken and modified. But that's what the rod of correction will drive it far from him, and I have that one as the next one. But we don't read this one. Discipline your son, for there is hope. Discipline your son, for there is hope. Do not set your heart on putting him to death. The NIV translates this as discipline him, or the King James translates discipline the son while there is hope. Do not commit him to death. Of course, Proverbs 21:15, folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him. Proverbs 29:15, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. I mean, come on, Solomon, that's really pointed here. All right, I told you I'd give you a chance. How would y'all define discipline? I've given you a couple scriptures here that might direct our thoughts. How do we define discipline? Any takers? Jim?
Instruction or correction.
Instruction, correction.
It's a training. I mean, athletes discipline themselves to get better at what they're doing. And
It's a training.
Their errors and improve their performance and reach that goal.
So it's a process of purposeful training for the goal of becoming better at the pursuit. Mm-hmm.
I think we have to place it based on your subject. This is external discipline, not self-discipline. But that's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to self-discipline because a child doesn't know to self-regulate. They'll eat all the candy in the jar. That's just because I'm hungry. It tastes good, so I'll just keep eating it. I will do whatever, and so discipline is at some form helping to recognize, however you do it, this behavior is wrong, and this is the correct behavior, and you're trying to discipline that, where eventually they say, this behavior is wrong, and this is the correct behavior.
So maybe it's discrimination between behaviors with the goal of instilling the ability to make that judgment call themselves.
Yeah. I think that'd be a working place.
These are all good. And we see that in these scriptures here, right? We love discipline, you love knowledge, implying that discipline is a source or a way to gain knowledge. And the converse is true. If you don't like correction, so discipline is clearly tied to correction, then you're stupid because that's the opposite of discipline. Discipline brings hope. Discipline is a good thing. I know, especially growing up, oftentimes, I'm going to get disciplined. It's a very negative thing. But discipline is a good thing. Discipline is a source of hope. Discipline is a way to drive away folly, foolishness. And discipline is a way for us to be honorable. I have another verse up here that I want to read. And Sarah, go ahead and bring me to the next slide.
I think Proverbs 19:18 is just worth commenting on, just simply because it's, when you talk about this, when you're talking there is hope, it doesn't have to be like this. That's
right.
The hope.
That's the hope of discipline.
That's the hope of discipline. You don't have to do
This is the behavior we see, but it doesn't have to be this way. There is hope. If we discipline them, there will be different behavior. This is very true. All right, in Revelation, we have this charge to the church of Laodicea. It's a little bit, it's not too bad. To the angel of the church in Laodicea write, the words of the Amen, the faithful, true witness, the beginning of God's creation. I know your works, you're neither hot nor cold. Would that you were either hot or cold, but because you're lukewarm and you're not hot or cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, I need nothing, not realizing that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. I counsel you to buy from me gold refined by fire so that you may be rich, and white garments so that you may clothe yourself in the shame of your nakedness and may not be seen, to anoint your eyes so that you may see. How do you do that? Okay, how do I, Lord, if we are in this position where we think we are rich, we think we are prosperous, we think we are needing nothing, but really we're in this pitiable, enviable, or unenviable, horrible position, how do I do these things? Well, because I love you. Those whom I love, I reprove and discipline. So be zealous and repent. The correct response to discipline is repentance. It's a change. It's a a change of position. It's a change of mind. It's a change of direction. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him and he with me. So I wanted to read this verse because this is another aspect of discipline. It is correction for relationship. And it's correction so it's relationship to God, it's relationship to yourself. It's correction to avoid deception. Discipline helps us to avoid being deceived. When we think that we are one way, when we think we are good, when we think we are right, when our children think that their behavior is appropriate, when they think that they have the world figured out, this is no, you are rich, you think you're prosperous, but really, you're not. And you have to receive from me this correction. But it's tied up with this. Because I love you, I'm not going to let you stay there. I want you to fix it so that we can be back in relationship. And these are all tied together, right? I will correct your poor position. I will give you the things that you lack, even though you think you have them. And if you will respond to discipline, then I will be able to come in. I'm knocking at the door. That knocking is my discipline. I'm trying to have a relationship with you, but because you don't understand, you've shut me out. But if you will open your eyes, listen to me, let me correct you, then I can come in, I will eat with you and you with me, and we'll have restoration of relationship. So discipline is tied into all these things. And then in Hebrews, we have a passage I wanted to read. And of course, this is the famous follow to the Hall of Faith, right, where the author talks about all these men and women of God. He says, therefore, since we are so surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight, which clings so closely. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus. He's our example. He's the founder. He's the perfecter. He disciplined himself because there was a goal. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So considering him, when we think about Jesus, who endured all those things for us, so that we would not, then we shouldn't grow weary or get faint-hearted. Have we struggled like Jesus struggled? No, we haven't struggled like he has. Have we not forgotten the exhortation that addresses us as sons? This is the Proverbs 3 that I said I was going to quote. Hebrews quotes it here. Go ahead and take me to the next slide. There's this one and one more. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. And then the writer of Hebrews explains what exactly that means. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as his sons. He loves you. He is invested in you. He wants you to be his heir. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, so discipline is a universal thing. Everyone has participated in discipline of some form or another. Then you are illegitimate children and not sons. If you were truly, a father disciplines his son, he might not discipline his illegitimate sons. Besides this, we have earthly fathers who disciplined us. We respected them for their discipline. Should we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a short time as seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. So discipline in the moment is not necessarily pleasant. It's hard, it's painful, it's uncomfortable. But later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. And so therefore, because of the value of discipline, he ends with these two verses. And Sarah, if you can advance to the next slide, please. Therefore, because of the value of discipline, lift up your drooping hands, strengthen your weak knees, make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. So, all of these passages, I'm trying to give you a biblical understanding of what discipline is. It's for correction, as we said. It's for training. Paul gives the same example of a runner in 1 Corinthians that runs a race, and he's disciplining his body so that he can successfully complete the race. He doesn't just do it haphazardly or slapshod. He's purposeful. He's disciplined so that he can succeed. We see that it's about relationship. It's about the love. It's born out of love. It's founded on love. Because I love you and because I don't want to consign you to death, because I want to correct the problems that will lead you to death or lead you to a bad outcome or lead you to separation, I'm going to tell you and I'm going to teach you. It's active. It's purposeful. And in this passage, I wanted to point out a couple of things. Discipline requires endurance on the part of those being disciplined. It's an intentional part of the person doing the discipline because they love them. It can be painful, it can be unpleasant when you're going through it, but the whole point of discipline is that it leads to better outcomes. You choose the harder path because that leads to a better outcome. And if we will live a life of discipline, then there are going to be things that are lame, there are going to be things that are out of joint and broken, but discipline puts them right. Discipline gets them back healthy. You know, I mentioned this earlier in the series. Sometimes we joke, you know, everybody screws up their children. The question is just, how am I going to screw up mine, right? Well, okay, yes, we all make mistakes. Yes, there are going to be things our children, but if we have a healthy pattern of discipline, we are correcting those things as they come up. Yes, our children are not going to get to adulthood perfect without hitting any speed bumps, without making any bad choices, without us making bad choices that affect them. But if we have a healthy pattern of discipline, discipline helps us to brace the wound, to put a cast on it so that it can be set properly and heal and be healthy. Discipline. All right, let me bring it a little bit more closer to parenting, because I think there are a couple other things that are very, well, what is discipline? We've seen throughout these scriptures self-control, right? It's a synonym in the Bible. You can look throughout a lot of these scriptures, and some translations will translate it discipline, some will translate it self-control. And Brother Gossett mentioned that. The goal is self-control on the part of our children, on the part of the one being disciplined. But that has to be taught.
Right.
But that's what discipline is. It is fundamentally about me being able to make the choices that I want to make. Me being able to have a goal, like Jesus, who had a goal. There was a joy set before him, so he went through what he needed to go through. He made the choices he needed to make to have the outcome he wanted. That's the result of discipline. It's a person who's able to say, this is my goal, this is what I want, this is what it's going to take to get that, and so I'm going to do what it takes to achieve my goal. That's discipline. So one thing I want to kind of, as we're talking about this, when we're talking about discipline, I want to separate out discipline as a practice. How do we teach? How do we train? Versus what are we teaching, right? There's a worldview that we have to discipline towards, right? If discipline is the ability to choose to make progress toward my goal, then part of that is what goal am I trying to make progress towards, right? I can choose to discipline my child specifically so they grow up to be a piano prodigy. That's going to lead to a very different value set that I'm instilling into them than other choices I could make. And so for the next week or two, I'm talking about the practice. How do we effectively discipline? I'm not going to touch too much on the values. You'll get that in all of the other lessons and sermons. We'll get to that. Maybe we'll get to that next week. It talked about the rod several times, so we'll touch on it. But so discipline, self-control, the ability to choose and do what I intend to do. I want us to, Sarah, can you go to the next slide, please? I want us to think of discipline kind of from these points of view, and then we'll expand on it a bit. It's self-control, the ability to make choices that purposely line up with my long-term goals. The purpose of our discipline is to instill right thoughts. We are trying to teach them how to think. We're trying to teach them how to process. We're trying to teach them how to make their own judgment, because the goal is for them to have self-control. And this is one of the big mistakes that we often make as parents, because when we start this game, we can't do this. Well, you kind of can, but we don't realize it. We don't understand it. When the game starts, they can't understand us. They don't know English or whatever language we want to speak. They don't know it. They don't even understand their own biological needs. They cry because they're hungry, and they've never been hungry before. In the womb, they were never hungry. So when they first come out, they're pretty sure they're dying. This hunger is this existential crisis. I'm dying. I've never felt this before. They don't understand anything. You can't tell them anything. You can't teach them anything. Has anyone tried to reason with the 6-month-old? No. I mean, it's a joke, right? The clueless guy who's like, why are you doing this? Well, it's a baby. What What do you expect? So we start with this mode of, I've got to enforce correct behavior. I've got to make sure you do what you're supposed to do and don't do things you're not supposed to do. And that's valid, because once they can start walking and running, there's a lot of places they can't walk and run, or they shouldn't walk and run, that they don't have the mental capacity to understand why they shouldn't walk and run there. So I have to enforce correct behavior. That's part of my job as a parent. But that's not really discipline. Really, discipline is about teaching them how to make good choices. And then that should lead to right behavior. So we're trying to instill right thoughts so that the right behavior will emerge. Because remember, one of our principles was we're going from total dependence to total autonomy, ideally. We want to raise children that when they get to adulthood, they're completely capable. They don't need us. I want them to want us, but they shouldn't need us. So they have to have all the tools to make their own decisions. So discipline is about instilling right thoughts. And discipline is about teaching and growing, not passing judgment. And this one is one of those that's very easy for us to think and can be very difficult for us to do in practice. Because a lot of times the negative behaviors that we're trying to correct have very real negative consequences for us. And, Proverbs even mentioned it, right? The undisciplined child is a shame to its mother. So I'm just thinking, when I read that verse, excuse me, I'm thinking of being in the grocery store and our children wanting to push the cart, but us being very, no, you cannot push the cart. But mom has to be careful, because when she goes to leave the cart and grab something off the shelf, there goes one of our children, which will not be named, to grab the cart and start running with the cart. And they're going to run into an aisle, they're going to run into a person, they're going to run into someone else's cart. And so, the immediate reaction is anger, frustration. I've told you not to do that. This is a dumb idea, and you are doing it, and I expressly told you not to. And so my reaction is, what do I do to make you not do that again? But that's not discipline, right? Discipline is not punishment. The goal of discipline is not to be fair. This is tricky, because probably one of the values we want to instill is a sense of fairness. But that's not the point of discipline. The point of discipline is not to punish them for every infraction. The point of discipline is to teach them how to not have infractions. It's to teach them how to behave correctly. Now, discipline often does contain positive and negative incentives, but I find it very helpful not to think of it as punishment for a crime committed, but rather a tool to help direct them towards good behavior. I'll probably touch on this more deeply, but negative incentives, I'll get there. Cause and effect is the core principle of healthy discipline, I think, in that if you can teach them to think through cause and effect, then a lot of things become easier. And that's where the positive and negative incentives come from. What I really want you to do is I want you to understand that if you make good choices, there are good outcomes, right? There are always consequences to every choice. Every choice has a consequence, good or bad. And so I want you to think through those consequences before you make choices. And sometimes there are going to be negative consequences that they don't feel the negative, or there's going to be choices they make, the negative consequences are too far removed in the future for it to be effective. So I have to bring those forward so they have an immediate feedback for their negative consequence. Discipline. We'll touch on that more. So, discipline is not punishment. The goal is to teach. I also want to touch on this briefly, and we'll go past. Discipline, we talked about in unconditional love last week, which we'll get last week we were offline. If you're watching, please go back and watch the first two series if you haven't seen them. The second one's not up yet. I'll get it up this afternoon. We were offline last week. But last week we talked about unconditional love. And one of the things we said about unconditional love is it's a property of the giver, right? I choose to love them regardless of the state of the person being loved. Discipline is the opposite. Discipline is about the state of the person being taught. It's not about me. And if we can internalize that, it helps. Because discipline is not about my feelings. It's not about what's best for me, what's most convenient for me. Discipline is about what is best for them. It's about them. All right. Are y'all still with me? I know this has been high. I want to touch on one more kind of high-level concept, and then we'll see how far we get. And I may pick up next time. But if you can go to the next slide, Sarah. Who has heard of this term? If there's anyone in here, I will be very impressed. Lacey's not here. She might have read this in her study. Hebbian plasticity. It's a very simple idea. It's named for a scientist that no one knows, so of course it sounds weird. It's like Maxwell's equations. Anyways, Hebbian plasticity is named for a psychologist. His name was Donald Hebb. And what it states is basically when two neurons in your brain activate together repeatedly, the connection between them becomes stronger. A colloquial way of saying it is neurons that fire together, wire together. What this means is that when you do things and your brain thinks and works, the pathways that your brain is creating get reinforced. This is why practice works. This is how practice works, right? If I am practicing piano and I play a chord, when I put my hands in that position, the brain pathways necessary to tell my hands to do that get reinforced. And the more I do that, the more my brain says, oh, this is important. And as those neurons that make up that pathway coordinate together, the brain reinforces that connection. This has, yes?
I've got a great example of this because I made this principle caused me to make a very hilarious mistake last week. Why did I have Nehemiah as Ezra's middle name until I remembered, oh, it's in the Bible. It's Ezra, Nehemiah. I've always said Nehemiah right after I say Ezra, and Nathaniel's close enough to Nehemiah for me my brain to say, that's probably what you meant. So.
The pathway between Ezra and Nehemiah in Brother Goss's brain is very well established. Ezra and Nathaniel, not so much. But the more time you spend around Ezra and Nathaniel, you'll get it. So let me break this down a bit and what it means. There's a couple of very important things that come out of this. One is it means our brain is self-modifying. We can literally think ourselves to a different mental state. It's not easy. It takes time and repetition, but we can modify our own brain's programming just by how we use it. How we use our brain will become better at doing what we do. This is why we say things like, the person I'm going to be next year is the sum of all the choices I make right now. Because what I do will change my brain to make me better at the things that I do. If I decide to, this is a great example with Adele. She knows I've told this story before, so I don't think she'll be too upset. But, she's one of the things she had to learn is how do I control my anger? And I had to have this conversation with her. Like, it's tempting to think that when I'm angry, I should get it out. I should punch my pillow. I should do something to vent my anger. But actually, that's the wrong thing to do. Because what you're doing is you're training your brain to be angry. And then you act out that anger, and it reinforces the anger. And then you become more angry, and you get in this spiral of anger. What I have to do is recognize I'm angry and choose to think a different way. And I've got to do that enough to disconnect that quick path from anger to action and build a different pathway in my brain. This actually has biblical, this is in the Bible. If you look in Philippians 4:8, I don't have a verse for it, my apologies. It's not on there. Finally, brothers, whatsoever thing is true, whatsoever thing is honorable, what is just, what is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think on these things. What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. If you want to live a peaceful life, let your brain focus on things that are good, that are lovely, that are of God. Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. This is another one we quote all the time. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by, who knows the verse? The renewing of your mind. That by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, perfect. So this principle means that when we use the way we use our brain affects its structure. It's constantly rewiring itself. This is how skill acquisition works, right? This is how habits are formed. It's why habits work. And it's not, just to be clarified, this isn't like the magical, the secret stuff where I think I manifest into the world the things that I think. I can't manifest $1 million into my bank account, as wonderful as that might be. We've tried. But we can transform our own brains. You can think your way to a better brain. Now, and fundamentally, I think we limit ourselves a lot more than the actual limits are. People have different capacities and predilections, but I believe fundamentally that anybody can become good at anything if they're willing to put in the time and effort.
Amen.
Now, the time and effort might vary for different people and different things, but if you are willing to do it, you can excel at pretty much anything. And I would argue that many, maybe most, of the mental disorders that we deal with today are breakdowns in this mechanism or some dysfunction that's affecting it, right? You can't always just think yourself better, I want to be clear. But a lot of times, I mean, that's what, if you think of mindfulness meditation, if you think of cognitive behavior therapy, a lot of these psychological counseling therapies are about training you to use your brain to fix itself. We are Hope Family Fellowship. We'd reason with him, but he's not there yet. That's what we're talking about. So, anyways, let me get to some of the implications of this on behavioral development. This Hebbian plasticity, this neurons that fire together, wire together, this means that when you repeat a specific behavior or action, the neurons involved grow a stronger connection. And this makes it easier to repeat that behavior in the future, right? It also means that as we do this more, the strengthening of that pathway gets to the point where it becomes more automatic, right? We don't have to think about it as much, or it doesn't take as much mental effort. How many of y'all remember driving, or you've taught someone else how to drive?
Right.
And if you, like nowadays, I get in the car, I don't think about the gas pedal, I don't think about the steering wheel, I don't think about, there's so many things I just don't think about, they just happen automatically. But when you have a new driver that gets in the car, they can't even, they don't even have throttle control. Because they have no neural pathway built up for how to handle this. A motorcycle is even worse. I've seen many people I've been there when they've grabbed it and pulled the throttle and ring, the bike goes up because they have no context. But now if I hop on my bike, I don't even think about it. It's totally subconscious because it's become automatic. As these habits become more deeply ingrained, it reduces our cognitive load. Again, coming back to driving, like as a new driver, you can't pay attention to all the stuff around you. You can't pay attention to the cars and like trying to keep up with highway and traffic and all that's total overload because you're just trying to remember how to keep the steering wheel straight. But as you do it more, now I don't think about that stuff. Now I can direct my attention to other stuff. Well, think about the implications for learning anything. For learning things like anger management, which I hope we're trying to teach our children. For learning things like controlling their speech. You have to recognize that when things start, it's going to take a while and they're going to have to focus on, break it down into small pieces. Start with the simplest thing. Just don't get overwhelmed by, they can't even do this. I mean, how are they possibly going to do, how are they possibly going to stop screaming at their brother if they can't even stop? I'm trying to think of a good example of how to break it down. Start small. Don't get discouraged. One little piece at a time. As they get better at that, then they will have more capacity to handle the next thing. So as we develop, it reduces cognitive load. Another good example of this is language and pronunciation. How many of y'all think about the way you move your tongue when you pronounce words? I don't. I don't think I ever have. I didn't think about how we form vowels until we had Rylan, who had to go to speech therapy to correct somehow and then I thought, I guess that's how, that's why she's saying it with a th instead of a th. Now but I don't think about that. We don't teach that to our children, right?
They don't know how to whisper either.
They don't know how to whisper, true. So, reduction of cognitive load, a resistance to change. This makes it harder and harder to break pathways that have been established, right? So this is why it's difficult to change habits. Think of like language accents, right? It's very difficult to completely eliminate an accent. It's even more difficult to attain a new accent. And depending on how different the language is, it may be impossible to accurately pronounce some things because you didn't learn it early enough. And it's just, you're not going to get there because the pathways for your pronunciation in your brain are so deeply entrenched. All right, so implications for discipline. So I said discipline is about self-control. It's about instilling right thinking that'll lead to right behavior. Discipline is giving, here's another way to think about discipline. Discipline is giving your children the tools to consciously manage this brain process. This is what we're trying to do with discipline. We're trying to teach them how to manage their own brains of evolution. It's their own brain changing over time. I want them to understand how to manage their own brain. We're teaching them to be stewards of their own mind. You know, we have an epidemic of mental health in our youth today. Do you know why? I believe fairly firmly that the reason is because they're bombarded, they're absolutely flooded with inputs, influences, voices, people trying to talk into their life. And by and large, they've not been taught anything about how to manage their own mental state of mind. They don't have these tools to decide what they're going to let affect their mind. And oftentimes, they don't even want this huge amount of distraction. They don't have the tools to fix it. It makes me think of another verse in Proverbs 25:28. A man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls. If we don't have the ability to discipline ourselves, we have no ability to defend our most inner part of our mind. Okay, I know there's been a lot of principles, and I hope it's useful. The goal here is, from this, we can build effective tools for discipline. From this, we can understand what's going to be effective, what's not going to be effective, and why. Let me give you a couple more practical implications of this fact about how our brains work. One is, as parents, we should expect it to take time for new principles and behaviors to take hold. Their brain has to adopt the new pattern. It has to do it enough and practice it enough to be able to form the passage. We have to focus more on right thinking than right behavior. And this is hard because we can measure the behavior. It's much harder to measure the thinking. But we're aiming for the thinking. Both are important, and right thinking should lead to right behavior, but we have to recognize and validate when our children have the right thoughts, but they just didn't execute it properly. Like if I can tell they were trying to do the right thing, that's what I reward, because I'm interested in their patterns of thought. This is also why we're not Pavlov's dogs, right? Like you can kind of get away with operant conditioning on little children, but very soon it stops working because they have the ability to work their own brain. And if you don't get in what's going on in here, you're in trouble. Reinforcement training doesn't really work with children. We're not trying to instill right behavior, we're trying to instill right thinking. Immediate feedback is necessary for this to work, because the brain is going to process immediately the environment it's in. Long feedback cycles don't work. They don't work until once the child is old enough to do the thinking on their own, then long feedback cycles can work better, but it's not really like, it's a two-step process, right? You're giving them something to think about, and then as they think about it, now it's impacting them. But immediate feedback is better. This reinforcement loop is a subconscious process. It's not in our conscious control. We can't rely on them to figure things out for themselves. This is why we have to discipline. They need scaffolding via explicit instruction and practice and examples lived out in their lives. Now, as our children grow, they gain a whole multitude of new capabilities, and sometimes it feels like, they just wake up and suddenly, I don't know if you've ever seen those small kids, and you have like a glass of water, the one that's tall and skinny and one that's wide and fat, and you take the tall, skinny glass of water, you pour it into the small one, and at some level, they don't understand that it's the same volume of water, right? They think that it's changed the amount because you've changed the container and the shape. But there comes a point of development in their brain where they understand, oh, no, it's the same water, it's just changed shape. That's a developmental thing. That happens. There'll be days where it wakes up and like suddenly they can figure things out they couldn't figure out yesterday. Wow. That's really cool to see as a parent. But the thing is, even those processes rely on the context that's around them. This is like language acquisition, right? How do they learn how to say D's? We don't teach them, put your tongue against the upper roof of your mouth to go duh, and put it against the teeth to go tuh. Right? We don't teach little children that. Part of it is they have to grow to the point where their brain can have enough connections to do that. But part of it is they have to hear it. They have to see it. If they don't hear it and see it, they don't develop it. They don't have that, they don't learn it. So they don't just figure things out. They will figure things out, but it's going to depend on what's around them. If we want to be intentional about how our children grow, we have to be intentional about what they are surrounded with. And this is driven by this principle, right? The things they practice are the things they will get good at. The things they see modeled, because that's another part of how this practice works. It's amazing, actually, if you look at the research. One, like if you're practicing an instrument, they've noticed, like if I actually have my instrument in my hand and I play, right, it activates my brain in certain ways. If I think about, like as I'm playing here, if I think about, and if I replicate it in my mind enough, like the patterns that I'm playing, the same pathways light up, even though I'm not physically with the instrument. So there's this mimicry circuitry in the brain. And that's how a lot of this learning happens, is I'm seeing, I'm watching, I'm mimicking in my own mind, and that's creating pathways. So we have to give them something to mimic. And this is why I'll stop here, and we'll pick up next week on some, let's take these principles and let's make them very practical, worked examples. Let's look at real life. How does this work with our kids? And bring it down a bit. But I'll leave you with this. This is also why the most important source, I told you that you can't reason with a 6-year-old, but you can teach and discipline a 6-year-old. The way you do it is by example. Or not 6-year-old, 6-month-old. My apologies. You can reason with a 6-year-old. You can actually reason with a 6-year-old. You can. Limited, but you can. And we'll touch on that next week. One of the things I wanted us to do is those principles we talked about the first week, those 9 or 10, let's apply them here. We'll talk about that next week. But 0 to 5, and there's lots of research that looks at the different ways. This is my kind of, from what I've seen and my understanding of it, here's my thoughts. From 0 to 5, you're teaching your children almost exclusively by example. Not entirely. You can teach them by some. But even the verbal instruction you're giving them is usually paired with a worked example. You grab their hand and you show them how to do it. You prevent them from going here and you reinforce it with language. From 0 to 5, you're teaching them by your example. And it's not even by your explicit example, it's by who you are. And this is the age that they learn their core fundamental values. Things like, what does it mean to be kind? How do I interact with other people? These are rough ages. 5 to 10, they're learning to reason about those core values that you've instilled in them. Now, it's not too late. Let's say 0 to 5, just saying, our family was in a mess that time, and we really, looking back, I don't feel like we really gave them the foundation they needed. It's not too late. Right. You can fix that. But just know it's going to take more time. You're going to have to work harder to establish some of this stuff, and it's going to rely more on them, too. 5 to 10, they're learning to reason consciously about all those values you put into them subconsciously, and you need to start explaining things. 5 to 10 doesn't feel like they're an adult. It feels like they can't get it, but they can get more than you think they can. They understand more than you think they can. You need to be explaining. 5 to 10, for the most part, they just believe you. They accept your word as true. You're their source. 10, 11, 13 to 20-something. Well, we'll touch on that. They're reevaluating everything they've learned in the context of figuring out who they want to be. So, and this is I know I'm a bit over time. I apologize. A couple minutes. That clock's fast, but I'm still over. I have a big problem with our American expectation that teenagers are rebellious. Teenagers are not rebellious. we misparent. Teenagers are rebellious because they've gotten to a point in life where they're figuring out who they are and they need the freedom to do that. But they're also not actually fully mature yet, and they can't entirely handle that freedom. So if we as parents continue in this mode of, I am the source of your values, I am the source of what makes sense, and you will do as I say, if we parent out of this, I expect right behaviors, then yes, there's going to be rebellion. Because they're questioning all of that. They're figuring out who they are, what matters, what kind of person do I want to be. And the only way I can really know is to test things. I've got to try the boundaries. I've got to see if what you said is really true. And if I respond by, no, you're not allowed to do that, then you're denying my ability to self-actualize who I am as a person. That's particularly for some personalities, that's very, very, leads to immediate fights. But if we can put ourselves in the position of, look, I'm not against you. I'm trying to teach you how to think. And what I'm recognizing is you're coming to the point now where you've got to figure this, you've got to take all of this and you've got to integrate it into your own worldview. And I'm no longer telling you what is, I'm presenting you to what we're shifting now. You're my peer. You're not there yet, but I'm getting you that way. And then instead of it being me versus you, even when I have to discipline, and even when I have to set hard boundaries and say, look, you're not doing this, I can do it in such a way that says, look, I understand your thought process. Or at least I do if I'm talking to you, and we'll cover that some later. What I want to be able as a parent to say, I understand your thought process. I disagree with you, and because you're not mature, you do have some limits on what you're going to do. But I will give you freedom within this defined zone, even if I disagree with you. And when you show me that you're able to make good decisions, then I will expand your freedom. Because my goal is not to control you. My goal is to prepare you and equip you. So if you show me that you're prepared and equipped, that's the whole purpose. I'm just trying to protect you and give you the best start. I'm not trying to make you into me or force you down a path. I do have a path I want you to follow because I believe it's the right path. But that's the other side of this. I said we weren't going to talk about values. Here's the plug for values. You should live your values in such a way that it's so compelling that it convinces them it's the right values. If you can't do that, then let's talk about that. All right, I know I've gone over. I know this has been very high level. I struggle with this a bit. My wife can tell you how long I spent on this, and I still am not entirely happy with the result. But what I want you to get from this lesson is that discipline is not some mysterious, magical thing that some people have and some people don't, and there's no way to know, and that parenting choice is just as good as that choice. No, it's not. Now, I don't think it's very useful to compare parenting choices because the children are different. But there are a set of principles, and I hope you see how they're grounded in Scripture and grounded in how God made us and how we work. There are principles that we can look to find effective means of disciplining. Not punishing, not controlling, but teaching, guiding, preparing, equipping. We should be and can be well prepared to equip our children to be successful in life, to be able to have their own self-control. This is something that can be done. And that's my hope. I've given you a couple starting points there. And I'll try and get more practical next week, and we'll touch on specifics. I feel like I could teach on this topic to July, but we don't have that time. We'll break now for a few minutes and we'll start our main service. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope this has been a valuable jump into the topic.